Hi, I'm Tim Smith and I'm co-presenting today with Dr. Carmen Elrick-Barr. Before I get started, I wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Our presentation today is focused on what is valued. We're critiquing Australian coastal legislation, policies and plans. It forms part of a bigger project on coastal governance that's funded through the Australian Research Council and also affiliated with Future Earth Coasts. Essentially what we're exploring is this idea of intent. And it builds on a paper that we published in 2012 where we were critiquing climate change adaptation strategies and questioning whether adaptation was actually adaptation in its intent or whether it was actually manipulating external systems. We're exploring this through trying to understand the worldviews that underpin laws and policies. So that's essentially what our research question is. How are worldviews represented in laws, policies and plans relevant to Australian coastal issues? Why is it important? Well, laws, policies and plans do guide our responses to coastal regions. The instruments also contain normative views regarding what matters and why. The way problems are framed are not only important for integration, but they can also importantly potentially exclude important alternative perspectives. There's also no other previous assessment of problem framing within instruments relating to coastal issues in Australia. So how do we do this? There were three key research steps. The first was to develop a conceptual framework of worldviews. Secondly, to undertake policy analysis to determine the framing, to understand the policy paradigms. And thirdly, to explore trends in problem framing. What are the implications for coastal regions into the future? So there are many different worldviews, as we know, frameworks for understanding them, but none that we found that were directly applicable to coastal sustainability. However, in 1996, Dobson published a paper which tried to understand worldviews by asking a set of questions. What is valued? Why is it valued? What should be done? How can we know? So we adopted a similar approach. And for those of you that want more information on the Dobson reference, it's copied here published in Environmental Politics. So the questions that we asked were, what is being protected? Why is it vulnerable? Why is it to be protected? What are the objects of primary and secondary concern? How can it be protected? And who's responsible? Now we analyse this through trying to break the different instruments into three different key worldviews: anthropocentric, people-centred; ecocentric, centred on environmental issues; and also those that covered both anthropocentric and ecocentric, a hybrid classification. We did try to break anthropocentric down in a more nuanced way, where we tried to understand public good versus private interest, but we found it was actually too difficult to make that distinction in some of the instruments. So we ended up with three key categories. So how did we select the instruments? Essentially, we focused on instruments that had high intentionality for coastal issues and high substantiality. So they addressed values, threats and actions in a comprehensive way in relation to coastal issues. This typology I have here of coastal instruments, Carmen and I developed and published recently in Ocean and Coastal Management. So if you want more information on that process, and we're also presenting on this during the conference as well, download the paper or come and see us. So from that process, we identified 48 instruments at local, regional and state scales. They covered 7 of our case study areas around Australia. And just to give you an example from Western Australia here, you can see here local, regional and state instruments and some summary of what is being protected, why is it being protected, why is it vulnerable and so on. So I'm going to hand over to Carmen now to talk a bit more about the methods and also to cover some of the findings of the project. Thanks, Carmen.
Thanks, Tim. So First of all, I just want to show a really quick example of what the process of the evaluation looked like for one of the instruments. So you can see here we've got an example of one instrument that was evaluated from Western Australia. And you can see on the left-hand side all of the questions that were asked for that instrument and then the answer. So this was completed for each one of the 48 instruments that were completed in the review. So what did we find? We found that the anthropocentric framing was clearly dominant, but there was quite a bit of variability based on jurisdiction, sector, and scale. So the anthropocentric framing occurred in about 50% of cases, compared to the hybrid framing, which was about 40%, and the ecocentric framing, which was almost 7%. So this suggests that coastal management instruments in Australia predominantly place attention on aspects of the environment that give rise to the benefits for people, with less emphasis on the interactions between people and the environment, and also in the values that the environment provides to non-human beings. But as I said, there was quite a bit of variation based on sector, scale, and jurisdiction. So if we first look at the framings across the different sectors, such as coastal, planning, and climate change. So instruments from the field of land use planning and climate change adaptation primarily align to the anthropocentric framing, whilst not as dominant, coastal instruments also contained responses that aligned to the anthropocentric framing. In contrast, the hybrid framing was dominant in instruments from the field of environmental and natural resource management and in instruments that integrated coastal and marine management. When looking at scale, local instruments really quite dominantly adopted the anthropocentric framing. This was present in about 75% of cases, in contrast to regional scale instruments and state level instruments, where the anthropocentric framing was less frequent then, or on equal par with the hybrid framing. Looking at the results across each of the jurisdictions, so at each state, we found that the anthropocentric framing was dominant in Queensland, Tasmania, and Western Australia, while the hybrid framing was dominant in the Northern Territory, New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia. In no instances was the ecocentric framing dominant in any of the Australian jurisdictions, although Victoria did have the highest proportion of responses that aligned to the ecocentric framing of all states. So the differences across each jurisdiction really reflect variation in the sector from which coastal management is led, and also the recency of policy reform. So for example, when led out of the planning system, the anthropocentric framing dominated, which was relatively consistent across scales. And this was the case in Western Australia and Queensland. When natural resource management was given institutional authority, or in the case of recently modified coastal legislation, such as which has occurred in Victoria and New South Wales, a social ecological systems framing or an ecocentric framing was more forthcoming. So what does the differences or similarities in framings across jurisdictions, across scales, etc., what does that mean for integrated coastal zone management? First of all, does the divergence enable more inclusive views to be brought into coastal decision-making, or does it inhibit horizontal, so cross-sector, or vertical cross-scale coordination? We also found that even within instruments, conformity to a single framing was not the norm. So in one single instrument, for instance, the answer to one of the sustainability questions could have been aligned to the anthropocentric framing, while the answer to another sustainability question might have been more closely related to the hybrid framing. There's the use of multiple frames within an individual person has a cognitive term called frame blending. So this is when multiple frames are adopted, which align to an individual's worldviews, and it helps them when interpreting information and determining response. So the question is, if this is a normal process of human cognition, can it also prove to be a useful way of coping with potential frame controversy, which is quite evident in issues that are complex, such as coastal management. So the use of multiple frames could be beneficial, for example, because each frame is talking to a distinct audience. But if one frame is emphasised over others, for example, through greater political authority, so the instrument might be legislated versus one that's not legislated, or through greater resource allocation, if one instrument receives greater funding than another, it can potentially dominate managed response, which then has implications for achieving certain management outcomes, such as broad public engagement or cross-sector and cross-scale coordination, and also potentially flexibility in the management response. Within Australia, federal government engagement in coastal management has become concentrated on two core components: natural resource management and climate change adaptation. And it's argued that this separation or duality in the way that we approach management of the coastal zone means that a holistic approach has been lost and is lost, which is really a requirement of integrated management. We also found that problem framing was compartmentalized. So for example, when considering the causes of vulnerability, climate change driven hazards or climate driven hazards such as erosion and inundation were the focus of instruments that adopted an anthropocentric framing. While the hybrid framing, which was more commonly associated with natural resource management instruments and marine focused instruments, adopted a broader view of management. So their view was coastal management as opposed solely to hazard management. And we work on the basis that no one worldview is holistic and that each brings a different perspective that can add to the management process. Multiple frames are therefore useful, but again, unless given equal and ideally coordinated attention, the values of one might be delivered at the expense of the other. We also found that there was problem solution coupling. So this refers to one framing, a problem framing being associated with a particular type of response. So for instance, the anthropocentric framing was associated with hazard management plans, while the hybrid framing was more closely aligned to coastal management plans. While natural resource management could address gaps in the hazard management solution, as I just mentioned, the duality of NRM and climate change potentially affects coordination. So what's the solution? An often proposed solution is a national framework whereby states would modify, but whether states would modify their position, is uncertain, and perhaps probably less important than the ability to coordinate between existing instruments and sectors in each jurisdiction. And even if there is willingness to change, frame entrenchment, so this is a situation where a particular problem framing becomes entrenched and is really difficult to move away from. This can often be a barrier to changing approaches. So the work that's been undertaken is really a first step in frame critical analysis, and it provides information for managers and policymakers to review their instruments and consider the implications of the frames that lie within. Future research might want to extend some of this work and look at the development of the problem solution context within many Australian jurisdictions to determine whether there are leverage points or drivers of change. So they might want to consider how reframing occurs and how frames acquire standing or become renounced. Undertaking such research in Australia could provide insight into leverage points for change in circumstances where there is frame paralysis, so where the dominant problem framing doesn't seem to be changing and where there is recognised problem with that framing. So if you'd like to keep in touch, you can email Tim or myself. We also have a website, the following link, which has a whole pile of information about the project. It's the case study sites and also any of the publications that are coming out of the research, which you can all access through the website. Thanks very much.